Hours bled into one another under the harsh, unrelenting glare of the August sun. The mechanical roar of the vacuum trucks became a monotonous, deafening drone, a constant reminder of the grim purpose that had brought them all to this desolate patch of earth. For the investigators, forensic specialists, and law enforcement officers standing their silent vigil, the wait was an exercise in extreme mental discipline. They watched as the levels on the outside of the tanks, marked in stark black numbers, slowly, painstakingly began to drop. Finally, the call came over the radio. The first tank, the one Chris Watts had indicated held the body of his youngest daughter, Celeste, was pumped to a level where entry was possible. The industrial noise subsided, and in its place, a profound, anticipatory silence fell over the site. The entry was not a task for a detective. It was a hazardous, confined space operation that fell to a specially trained and equipped team from a local fire department, working in tandem with the CBI. A single firefighter, clad head to toe in a yellow hazmat suit, his breathing apparatus hissing rhythmically, was hooked to a safety line. Air quality monitors were lowered first, their sensors sniffing the toxic air for any sign of lethal gas. Only when the all clear was given did the slow, deliberate descent begin. The firefighter disappeared through the dark, 8-inch circle of the thief hatch. For a few agonizing moments, his only connection to the outside world was the safety line and the crackle of his radio. The investigators stood below, their faces turned upward, their expressions unreadable masks of professional focus. Then a voice, tinny and distorted by the radio, cut through the silence. It was a single, grim confirmation. "We have visual." The word visual was a cold, professional term for a sight of unimaginable heartbreak. Submerged in the thick black sludge at the bottom of the tank, they had found her. The delicate, respectful process of recovery began. Using a specialized harness and basket, the small, oil-coated form of 3-year-old Celeste Watts was carefully, reverently lifted from the dark abyss and brought back into the sunlight. A new, separate forensic tent was immediately established. Her small body was taken there, away from the prying eyes of the main scene, where a team could begin the initial heart-wrenching process of documentation and preparation for transport. There was no pause, no moment to process the horror. The focus immediately shifted to the second tank. The procedure was repeated, the roar of the trucks, the agonizingly slow draining, the solemn vigil. The psychological toll on the responders was palpable. They had just recovered one child from a tomb of crude oil. Now they had to steel themselves to do it all over again. Hours later, the call came for the second tank. The same firefighter, his face now etched with a profound exhaustion that no physical exertion could explain, prepared for another descent. Once more, he was lowered into the darkness, and once more the tinny voice came back over the radio, a second visual. Soon after, the body of 4-year-old Bella Watts was brought to the surface. Her recovery confirmed the final, terrible detail of her father's confession. The forensic pathologist on site would later note the signs of the struggle her father had described in his second confession, the details that spoke to a little girl who had been aware, who had fought, and who had pleaded for her life. By late afternoon, the grim work at Survey 319 was done. They had found all of them. Shannon, Bella, and Celeste were finally out of the hands of their killer and back in the care of a world that would mourn them. The investigators had succeeded in their mission to bring them home. But as the coroner's vehicles pulled away from that desolate oil field, leaving a silence that felt heavier and more profound than before, every single person who had worked that scene knew they were leaving a part of their own humanity behind, buried forever in that unholy ground. While the dust and gravel of Survey 319 were still being painstakingly collected and cataloged, the bodies of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste were transported to the sterile, antiseptic confines of the Weld County Coroner's office. Here, away from the raw emotion of the crime scene, the final, incontrovertible truth of their last moments would be revealed, not by a confession or a GPS coordinate, but through the cold, impartial language of science. The autopsies began, a methodical and solemn procedure that would provide the victims with their last, most powerful testimony. The findings, when they were delivered to District Attorney Michael Rourke and the lead investigators, were a scientific demolition of the narrative Christopher Watts had so carefully constructed. His story, that he had killed his wife in a blind rage after discovering she had murdered their children, was not just a lie, it was a scientific impossibility. The autopsy on Shannon confirmed she had been manually strangled. Her unborn son, who would have been named Nico, had died as a result of her death. This part, at least, aligned with his confession to killing her. But the autopsies of Bella and Celeste told a different and infinitely more heartbreaking story. They had not been strangled, a fact that would have left distinct marks on their necks. Their cause of death was asphyxiation due to smothering. This was a critical distinction. Strangling can be a rapid act of violence. Smothering, by contrast, is a terrifyingly intimate and prolonged act. It requires the perpetrator to hold a pillow or a hand over the victim's face, overcoming their desperate, primal struggles for air until they fall still. For the prosecution, this was a linchpin. A man in a blind rage does not have the sustained, deliberate presence of mind to smother two separate children in two separate acts. Even more damning were the specific injuries found on 4-year-old Bella. Along with abrasions and contusions indicative of a struggle, the coroner found that she had bitten through her own tongue multiple times. This single, visceral detail painted a picture of unimaginable horror. A little girl, fully conscious and aware of what was happening, fighting so hard for her life against her own father that she had severely injured herself in her final, agonizing moments. With these findings in hand, District Attorney Rourke's path was clear. The physical evidence provided the foundation for the most serious charges possible under Colorado law. Chris Watts's self-serving confession was now more than just a lie. In legal terms, it was powerful evidence of consciousness of guilt, an attempt by a guilty party to create a less culpable version of events. On August 21, 2018, just a week after he had stood on his porch and pleaded for his family's return, the formal charges were filed. The legal documents were a stark and unemotional list of the evil he had wrought. 5 counts of first-degree murder, including 2 counts per child under a position of trust statute, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. Each charge was a legal hammer blow, constructing an ironclad case from which there would be no escape. The state was not just accusing him of killing his family. They were preparing to prove, beyond any doubt, that he had done so with a coldness and deliberation that was almost beyond human understanding. With the charges filed and Christopher Watts held without bond in the Weld County Jail, the media storm that had been brewing over Frederick erupted into a global tempest. The story had every element of a modern true crime obsession: an attractive, seemingly perfect family, a brutal and shocking betrayal, and a digital breadcrumb trail that allowed the public to follow the case in near real time. The story of the missing family had become the story of a monstrous husband, and the world was transfixed. Inside the Weld County District Attorney's office, the media frenzy was just noise. Prosecutor Michael Rourke and his team were focused on a single, monumental decision: whether or not to seek the death penalty. At the time, Colorado was a capital punishment state, albeit one that used it rarely. The legal standard for seeking the death penalty required the presence of specific aggravating factors that elevate a first-degree murder to a capital offense. The Watts case was a textbook example of such factors. The statute was practically written for a case like this. One of the prosecutors on the team later commented, "You had multiple victims. You had victims of a particularly young age, rendered helpless by their trust in the perpetrator. You had the killing being done in an especially heinous, cruel, or depraved manner. On paper, it was as clear-cut a death penalty case as you could ever imagine." The decision was not Rourke's alone. It involved extensive legal review, consultations with his senior staff, and a deep, sober-minded analysis of the potential outcomes. Seeking death would mean a long, grueling, and enormously expensive trial. It would be an all-or-nothing proposition. If a jury, for any reason, failed to reach a unanimous verdict for death, The result would likely be the same life sentence they could achieve with a plea. On the other side, the newly appointed public defenders for Christopher Watts were staring down an evidentiary avalanche. Their client had confessed not once but twice. His stories were contradictory and scientifically disproven by the autopsies. The digital evidence, the GPS data, the cell phone records, the details of the affair was irrefutable. A not guilty plea was not a viable legal strategy. It would be a futile and professionally irresponsible gesture that would only serve to inflame a jury and all but guarantee a death sentence. In this grim equation, the defense team's only real leverage was the one thing the prosecution, and more importantly, the victim's family, wanted to avoid: the trauma of a public trial. They could offer to spare the Arzusek family the agony of hearing every gruesome detail of their loved one's last moments relived and debated in open court. They could offer to spare them years, possibly decades, of appeals that a death sentence would inevitably entail. In exchange for this, they wanted the ultimate penalty taken off the table. And so, the quiet, back-channel negotiations began. The legal posturing that plays out in public is often just theater. The real work of the justice system happens in these solemn, pragmatic discussions between opposing counsel. The entire trajectory of the case, the question of whether Chris Watts would live or die, now rested not on a battle in the courtroom, but on a painful and complex negotiation between the lawyers and the profound, agonizing decision of a grieving family. For the Arzusek family, the initial shock and the raw, disbelieving grief of losing Shannon and their grandchildren had been brutally compounded by the horror of the truth. They had not been taken by a stranger in a random act of violence. They had been annihilated by one of their own, a man they had embraced as a son, trusted to protect his family, and who had looked them in the eye and lied while their daughter's body lay in a shallow, desolate grave. Their pain was immense, a landscape of sorrow so vast it seemed impossible to navigate. Into this landscape of grief, the grim realities of the justice system intruded. Frank and Sandy Arzusek and their son, Frankie, were not just mourners. They were the primary victims of the crime, and under Colorado law, their voices held significant weight. District Attorney Michael Rourke and his victim advocate team flew the family from their homes on the East Coast to Colorado for a series of private, intensely difficult consultations. In a secure, quiet conference room at the Weld County Justice Center, a room insulated from the media storm raging outside, Rourke laid out the two paths before them. He spoke not as a prosecutor seeking a victory, but as a guide tasked with explaining the terrain of two terrible options. He described the first path, a capital murder trial. He explained the legal process, the jury selection, the presentation of evidence. He told them that they would have to sit in a public courtroom and listen to the coroner describe in excruciating detail the injuries their daughter and grandchildren had suffered. They would have to look at crime scene photos that no family should ever have to see. They would hear defense attorneys, as is their duty, attempt to poke holes in the prosecution's case, a process that could feel like a fresh assault on their loved ones' memories. And if they were to achieve a death sentence, it would be just the beginning. It would trigger an automatic appeals process that could drag on for 20 years, a constant, agonizing legal battle that would keep Christopher Watts and his crimes in the headlines, preventing their wounds from ever truly beginning to scar over. Then he described the second path, a plea agreement. In this scenario, Chris Watts would plead guilty to every single charge against him. He would admit his guilt publicly and unequivocally. He would waive his right to all future appeals. In exchange for this complete and total admission, the prosecution would not seek the death penalty. The sentence would be mandatory and absolute, multiple life sentences, to be served consecutively without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. The case would be over, concluded with a finality that a death sentence could not provide for decades. It was an impossible choice, a decision that pitted the primal human desire for ultimate retribution against the deep, personal need for peace and an end to the public trauma. The family listened, their faces a portrait of contained sorrow, as Rourke carefully, respectfully laid out the grim calculus of justice. "I can tell you that the evidence we have is overwhelming," Rourke assured them. "I have no doubt we can secure a conviction at trial, but I cannot and will not make this decision without you. This is your case as much as it is the state's. Whatever you decide, my office will honor." The Arzuseks retreated to their hotel room to deliberate. They had to decide the fate of the man who had stolen their future. It was a burden no family should ever have to bear, a decision that would define the final chapter of their daughters' and grandchildren's story. In the sterile anonymity of a Colorado hotel room, a world away from the legal machinations and the public's insatiable curiosity, the Arzusek family confronted the most harrowing decision of their lives. The choice presented to them by District Attorney Michael Rourke was not about law. It was about the very nature of justice, grief, and survival. Their deliberation was a crucible of pain, a process that forced them to weigh their rawest, most primal emotions against a deep and abiding need for peace. The initial, overwhelming impulse was one of rage. Frank Arzusek, a father whose heart had been ripped from his chest, felt a burning desire for the ultimate penalty. Christopher Watts, in his view, was a monster who had forfeited his right to draw breath. He had not just killed, he had executed his own family, his own flesh and blood, in the most cowardly and brutal way imaginable. For a man who had stolen 4 lives, Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, a single life in return felt like an inadequate but necessary balancing of a cosmic scale. This was the voice of pure, unadulterated grief, a father's roar of anguish demanding an eye for an eye. But as they talked, as the initial waves of fury receded, the colder, more practical realities began to surface, brought into focus by Shannon's mother, Sandy, and brother, Frankie. The path of a capital trial was a path paved with unending trauma. They would be forced to listen, day after day, to clinical, dispassionate testimony about the last, terrifying moments of their loved ones. They would have to sit in stony silence as a defense team, doing its job, might attempt to cast aspersions on Shannon's character to create some form of mitigation for their client. The trial would make Christopher Watts the center of a public spectacle, granting him a platform and a level of notoriety that felt like a desecration of Shannon's memory. Frankie Arzusek articulated a sentiment that became the cornerstone of their final decision. A plea deal was not an act of mercy for Chris. It was an act of mercy for themselves. A death sentence, he argued, would not be an ending. It would be a beginning, the start of a decades-long legal battle that would keep them chained to the man who had destroyed their world. Every appeal, every hearing, every news cycle would be a fresh wound, a tearing open of the scar tissue they so desperately needed to form. "We don't want to see his face ever again," was the core of their consensus. They refused to grant him the power to dominate their lives for the next 20 years from his prison cell. A life sentence served without the possibility of parole was absolute. It was a guarantee that he would be locked away, silenced, and left to rot in the anonymity of the prison system. He would become a number, a ghost, while they could begin the impossible task of remembering their family not for how they died, but for how they lived. And so, with a strength that defied their unimaginable pain, they reached a unanimous decision. It was an act of profound grace. They would choose finality over vengeance. They would choose peace over a protracted war. They informed Michael Rourke of their decision, with one unwavering condition. Christopher Watts must plead guilty to every single charge, without exception. This was especially critical for the charge of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. For them, it was paramount that the life and murder of their grandson, Nico, be formally and legally acknowledged. With the family's blessing secured, the path was now clear. The district attorney's office had its mandate. The death penalty was off the table. The legal endgame was set. All that remained was for Christopher Watts to stand in open court and with his own mouth admit to the full scope of his monstrous crimes. November 6, 2018. The date was set. Inside the largest courtroom at the Weld County Justice Center, a heavy, expectant silence had fallen. The public gallery was packed to capacity, a somber and eclectic mix of Frederick residents, national media, and the stoic, weary faces of the law enforcement officers who had lived and breathed this case for the past 3 months. The Arzusek family sat in the front row, a small island of profound and private grief amidst a sea of public curiosity. They were not there for a spectacle, they were there to bear witness. When the side door opened and Christopher Watts was led into the courtroom, a collective, stifled breath was the only sound. He was flanked by his public defenders, his hands and feet shackled. The man who had faced television cameras with a mask of composed concern was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out figure. He was visibly thinner, his face gaunt, his gaze fixed on the defense table in front of him, a man seemingly determined to avoid the dozens of eyes that were burning into him, especially those of the family he had destroyed. The proceedings began with a clinical formality that felt surreal in the face of such profound human tragedy. The plea agreement had been signed and submitted. This hearing was the formal, public consummation of that deal. Judge Marcelo A. Kopkow presided, his demeanor grave and his voice deliberate. His task was to ensure, for the official record, that this plea was being entered into willingly and with a full understanding of its consequences. He addressed the defendant directly. "Mr. Watts, have you had sufficient time to discuss this plea agreement with your attorneys?" "Yes, Your Honor," Watts replied, his voice a low, raspy whisper, barely audible in the cavernous room. Judge Kopkow then began the litany, a formal recitation of the crimes that had shocked a nation. For each count, he asked the same simple question, demanding a verbal response that would be forever enshrined in the court record. To the charge of murder in the first degree, the victim Shannon Watts, how do you plead? There was a slight, almost imperceptible pause. Chris cleared his throat. Guilty. The word, though expected, landed with the force of a physical blow in the silent room. Sandy Arzusek flinched, her son Frankie putting a steadying hand on her arm. The judge continued, his voice an unwavering procedural metronome. To the charge of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, how do you plead? Guilty. Nico, their unborn grandson, was officially acknowledged. To the charge of murder in the first degree, the victim Celeste Watts, how do you plead? Guilty. To the charge of murder in the first degree, the victim Bella Watts, how do you plead? Guilty. One by one, the judge went through all 9 counts, including the multiple position of trust, murder charges for the children, and the 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. To each, the same whispered answer came from the man in the orange jumpsuit. Guilty. With that final admission, it was over. The legal battle had ended not with a dramatic courtroom clash, but with a series of quiet, monotonous, and utterly devastating admissions. Christopher Watts, by his own word, had officially branded himself a monster in the eyes of the law. He had surrendered his right to a trial, his right to appeal, and his right to ever again taste freedom. For the Arzusek family, there was no sense of victory, no cathartic release. There was only the profound, soul-crushing weight of hearing the man they once called family admit, with his own mouth, to the cold-blooded slaughter of their world. The truth was now a matter of public record. The question of his guilt was settled forever. All that was left was the sentencing, the day when they would finally be allowed to stand and speak their own truth directly to the face of unalloyed evil. The 13 days between the guilty plea and the sentencing hearing were a period of suspended animation for all involved. For Christopher Watts, they were his last days in the relative familiarity of the Weld County Jail, before being absorbed into the vast, anonymous monolith of the state prison system. For the Arzusek family, it was a time of excruciating preparation. They were not just composing statements, they were honing weapons, crafting words of pure, distilled grief and rage that would be their only and final opportunity to confront the killer of their family in a public forum. On November 19, 2018, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity, but the atmosphere was different. The hearing on the 6th had been about legal procedure. This day was about raw human emotion. It was the day of the reckoning. Christopher Watts was led to his now familiar spot at the defense table. At the adjacent table, District Attorney Michael Rourke sat with his team, stacks of files before them, their faces grim and resolved. In the front row, the Arzuseks and Shannon's closest friends formed a silent, united front. Judge Kopkow called the court to order. Before any sentence could be handed down, he invited the prosecution to speak. Michael Rourke rose to his feet. He did not give a dry legal summary. His voice ringing with a controlled fury, he painted a visceral, damning picture of the crime for the court, systematically and publicly dismantling the false rage-kill narrative Chris had tried to spin. "Your Honor, what we know is this," Rourke began, his voice cutting through the hushed room. "He coldly and deliberately ended 4 lives. He strangled the woman who had carried his children, the woman who was 15 weeks pregnant with his son. And then he drove his 2 daughters, not their bodies but them, alive and terrified, on a 45-minute trip to a place where he would methodically, and without a shred of human decency, extinguish their lives." Rourke's voice rose as he detailed Bella's final moments. She watched as her father smothered her little sister, and as he came for her, she fought back for her life. The bite marks on her own tongue were the silent testament to the agony and terror her own father inflicted upon her. "If he is a monster, it is because he has chosen to be one." He then detailed the defilement of the bodies, the choice to submerge his own children in crude oil, an act he described as the most depraved and vicious he had encountered in his career. When Rourke finished, the courtroom was a vacuum of stunned silence. His words had laid the foundation of evil. Now it was the family's turn to build upon it. The court officer called the first name, Frank Rzusek. Shannon's father, a man whose quiet demeanor was known to all, walked slowly to the lectern. He clutched a piece of paper, but his eyes, blazing with a father's righteous fury, were locked on the bowed head of Christopher Watts. He didn't speak to the judge. He spoke directly to the man who had destroyed him. "I have no idea who gave you the right to take their lives," he began, his voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "But I know God will give you a sentence you so richly deserve. You are a heartless monster. You took them out like trash. You buried my daughter in a shallow grave and then you put my beautiful granddaughters in oil tanks. You disgust me." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "I trusted you. We all trusted you. We welcomed you into our family and you took it all away. May God have mercy on your soul." Frank Rzusek had spoken for every father, for every family who had ever suffered an unthinkable betrayal. His words were a raw, unvarnished testament to the magnitude of his loss. The first impact had been delivered, and there was more to come. The emotional weight in the courtroom intensified as the next speaker was called. A victim's advocate stepped to the lectern to read a statement prepared by Sandra Rzusek, Shannon's mother. Her words, delivered by a proxy, were no less powerful. They carried the distinct voice of a mother whose heart had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The statement began not with rage, but with a sorrow so profound it seemed to draw all the air from the room. "I have been in a living nightmare every day and every night since August 13, 2018, the statement began. "My daughter, Shannon, was a wonderful, caring, and loving person. She wanted to be a mother more than anything in this world, and she was an amazing one. My beautiful granddaughters, Bella and Cease, were the light of our lives. They were smart, funny, and so full of life." The letter then turned its focus directly to the silent man at the defense table. The tone shifted from loving remembrance to a cold, searing indictment of his betrayal. "We loved you like a son. We trusted you. We thought you were a good husband, a good father. I was so proud of you, but you are a monster. You betrayed not just us, but your own children. How could you? Shannon was so excited to be having your son, Nico. She had already chosen his name, and you took that from him. You took that from her. You took that from us all." Then, in a stunning turn that showcased the family's immense strength and the depth of their faith, Sandra's statement moved beyond pure condemnation to a place of almost unimaginable grace. "I do not want to see your face in this world again, but I have prayed for you, and I will continue to pray for you. I pray that you find a relationship with God. I pray that you confess all of your sins. Your life is in His hands now." Her forgiveness was not an absolution for his crimes, but an act of spiritual self-preservation, a refusal to allow the poison of hatred to consume what was left of her own soul. Next, a statement from Shannon's brother, Frankie Rzusek, was read. It was a raw and furious tribute to his older sister, the protector and confidant he had lost. "You took away my only sister," he wrote, the words crackling with anger. You took away her chance to watch her beautiful children grow. She looked up to you, she loved you, and you repaid that love by stealing everything. You are evil, and I hope you are haunted every single day of your pathetic life by what you did to them, by the memory of their faces. The cumulative effect of the family's statements was overwhelming. They had stripped away every shred of legal formality, exposing the raw, bleeding wound at the heart of this case. They had given Shannon, Bella, and Celeste a voice in this final proceeding, transforming them from victims listed in a criminal complaint back into the vibrant, beloved people they had been. Through it all, Christopher Watts sat motionless, his head bowed, a stone statue against which this tidal wave of grief and rage was crashing. He offered no reaction, no flicker of emotion. Whether he was numb with shock, consumed by a private shame, or simply devoid of the human empathy required to process their pain, was impossible to know. He was a black hole of emotion, absorbing their agony and reflecting nothing. The family had had their say. Now all that remained was for the judge to deliver the final, irrevocable sentence. After the last of the family's heart-wrenching statements had been delivered, a profound and heavy silence once again fell over the courtroom. The air was thick with a collective, unspoken grief. It was now time for the defense to speak. Chris Watts's public defender, a young, earnest lawyer tasked with an impossible job, rose from his seat. The eyes of everyone in the courtroom, including the Arzusek family, were upon him. His client had pleaded guilty. There were no facts to dispute, no evidence to challenge. His only task was to offer a sliver of context, a brief, final word on behalf of a man who had committed the indefensible. He spoke briefly and with a somber respect for the proceedings. On behalf of Mr. Watts, he began, his voice low and even, we would like to express that he is devastated by this. And while he is deeply sorry for what has happened, he is in the process of coming to terms with it. It was a sterile, inadequate statement, the kind of legalistic language that could never hope to bridge the vast emotional chasm in the room. He confirmed that they had discussed the case extensively with their client, and that he had been in full agreement with the decision to accept the plea agreement to spare all parties the trauma of a lengthy and difficult trial. He then did something unexpected. He said, "Mr. Watts has asked me to express that. He is sorry." The second-hand apology, filtered through his attorney, landed in the silent room with a dull, hollow thud. It was a gesture too small, too late, and too impersonal to carry any real weight. Judge Kopkow then turned his gaze directly to the man in the orange jumpsuit. "Mr. Watts, do you wish to make a statement to the court at this time?" This was his moment. His one and only chance to speak directly to the family he had destroyed, to the community he had terrified, to the world that was watching. He could offer an explanation, an apology from his own lips, a single word of genuine remorse. He kept his head bowed. After a long, agonizing pause, he leaned slightly toward his attorney and whispered something. The lawyer then stood once more. "Your Honor, Mr. Watts has chosen not to make a statement." A quiet, collective gasp of disbelief and disgust rippled through the gallery. His silence in that moment was more damning than any confession. It was an abdication of responsibility, a final, cowardly retreat from the consequences of his actions. He would not or could not face them. With that, the time for words was officially over. Judge Marcelo Kopkow picked up a stack of papers, his expression a grim, resolute mask. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the man who sat before him. His voice, when he began to speak, was not loud, but it resonated with the full and final authority of the law. "Sir, I have been a judicial officer for 17 years now, and in that time I have seen some very, very terrible cases," the judge began, his words slow and deliberate, each one a hammer blow. "But this case is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. The grisly details of the discoveries of these bodies will not soon be forgotten from my mind or the mind of anyone else who has been exposed to the facts of this case." He was not just passing sentence. He was delivering a judgment, not just from the bench, but from a place of shared humanity. And that judgment was one of pure, unalloyed condemnation. Judge Kopkow paused, his gaze fixed on Christopher Watts, who who remained a hunched and defeated figure at the defense table. The judge's words had silenced an already hushed courtroom, creating a moment of pure, focused gravity. He was not just a jurist applying legal statutes. He was the voice of a community, of a state, and of a shared moral code that had been profoundly violated. The law provides for a number of sentencing options, but in this case, the plea agreement has stipulated the sentence, the judge continued, his tone a cold, procedural anchor in a sea of raw emotion. This is a decision that the district attorney has made in consultation with the victim's family, and this court will honor that agreement. The court finds the plea to be entered knowingly, voluntarily, and intelligently. He began to read from the formal sentencing documents, his voice devoid of any emotion, a stark recitation of legal and moral consequence. For each of the 5 counts of murder in the first degree, he delivered the same, immutable sentence. For the crime of murder in the first degree, victim Shannon Watts, the court hereby sentences you, Christopher Lee Watts, to the custody of the Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life, without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air, a legal encapsulation of forever. For the crime of murder in the first degree, victim Celeste Watts, the court hereby sentences you to the custody of the Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life, without the possibility of parole. This sentence shall be served consecutively to the previous count. For the crime of murder in the first degree, victim Bella Watts, the court hereby sentences you to the custody of the Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life, without the possibility of parole. This sentence shall be served consecutively to the previous counts. He imposed 3 consecutive life sentences for the primary murder charges, a legal maneuver ensuring that even if one sentence were ever, by some impossible turn of events, to be overturned, the others would hold him fast. He then added 2 more concurrent life sentences for the additional murder charges related to the position of trust. The legal barrage continued. For the charge of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, he sentenced Watts to 48 years, the maximum allowed by law, to be served consecutively. For the 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body, he added another 12 years for each, also to be served consecutively. In total, the sentence was a legal labyrinth from which there was no escape. 3 consecutive life sentences, 2 concurrent life sentences, and an additional 84 years tacked on for good measure. It was a sentence of legal and mathematical certainty. Judge Kopkow looked up from his papers one last time. "Mr. Watts, it is the order of this court that you be transported immediately to the Department of Corrections to begin serving these sentences." He paused, then delivered the final, resonant strike of the gavel. The sharp, definitive crack echoed through the courtroom. It was done. The legal process, from the first welfare check to the final sentencing, was over. Uniformed deputies moved in immediately, surrounding Chris Watts. They pulled him to his feet. He offered no resistance. He was a man whose earthly fate had just been sealed. As he was led out of the side door, back to a world of shackles and cells from which he would never return, the Arzusek family held each other. They did not weep with joy or relief, but with the profound, soul-deep exhaustion of a battle finally won, a chapter finally closed. There was no victory, only the grim satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. The man who had stolen their world would never, ever be free to harm anyone again. The story of Christopher Watts, the free man, was over. His story as a prisoner had just begun. The final crack of Judge Kopkow's gavel was not an end, but a transition. Inside the courtroom, the spell of suspended grief was broken. Deputies moved with swift, impersonal efficiency, leading a shackled and silent Christopher Watts out a side door, away from the public eye and into the bureaucratic labyrinth of the penal system. For him, the journey into a permanent, living oblivion had begun. Out in the main hallway, and then on the cold marble steps of the Weld County Justice Center, the other side of the story played out in the harsh glare of camera flashes. A phalanx of microphones and reporters, held at bay during the proceedings, surged forward as the courtroom doors opened. District Attorney Michael Rourke, flanked by the stoic, exhausted-looking investigators who had been the architects of this conviction, stepped up to the podium. His face, which had been a mask of prosecutorial fury in the courtroom, was now etched with a profound and weary solemnity. This was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment to honor the dead. Today, we have been able to close this chapter for Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, Rourke began, his voice steady against the shutterclick storm. The defendant was sentenced to the maximum possible sentences under Colorado law. And for what? For a new life. He was a man who cast his family aside for a fresh start. And in the process, he has sentenced a different family, the Ars-Usex, to a lifetime of grief and pain. He made a point to praise the meticulous, relentless work of the Frederick Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI. He spoke of the evil he and his team had been forced to confront, not as a legal abstraction, but as a tangible force they had battled for 3 months. Standing just behind him, the Ars-Usex family stood united, their arms linked. They did not speak. Their presence was their statement. Their faces, a portrait of staggering loss but also of unbreakable dignity, conveyed more than words ever could. They had endured the unimaginable and they had survived. They had seen justice done, not the justice of vengeance but the cold, hard justice of a locked door and a sentence of forever. They had given a voice to their daughter and their granddaughters, and now their public ordeal was over. For the investigators, men like Detective Dave Baumhover and Sheriff Steve Reams, the moment was bittersweet. Their work was done. A monster was caged, but there was no joy in it. The images of Survey 319 of the small, oil-covered forms being lifted from those dark tanks would be seared into their minds for the rest of their lives. You never forget a scene like that, Sheriff Reams would later say. It's the kind of case that takes a piece of you. You're relieved it's over, relieved there's a conviction, but there's no celebration. Because you know that for one family, the pain is just beginning. Our job is finished. Their sentence of grief goes on forever. While the cameras rolled on the courthouse steps, Christopher Watts was being processed out of the Weld County Jail. His orange jumpsuit was exchanged for the transport attire of a convicted felon. He was no longer a name, but a number. The short drive to the Denver Reception and Diagnostic Center, the intake facility for the Colorado Department of Corrections, was a quiet, anonymous journey, the final transition from suburban father to state property. The world he had killed his family to gain was now reduced to a view through a reinforced van window, a passing landscape he would never be a part of again. The journey from the Weld County Courthouse to the Denver Reception and Diagnostic Center is a short drive in terms of miles, but in the life of Christopher Watts, it was a passage into another dimension. The world of legal battles, plea negotiations, and media attention was over. He was now entering the cold, bureaucratic embrace of the Colorado Department of Corrections, a world governed not by judges and lawyers, but by steel doors, guard shifts, and the monotonous, unforgiving rhythm of institutional life. Upon arrival, the process of erasing his former identity and forging a new one began. The name Christopher Lee Watts was logged, but it was immediately supplanted by an inmate number, 670-4556. His street clothes, the last remnants of his civilian life, were taken and replaced with the drab, stay-tissued uniform of a prisoner. He was photographed again, but this was not the defiant mugshot of an arrestee. It was the flat, emotionless intake photo of a man beginning a sentence with no end date. He was weighed, measured, and medically screened. He had ceased to be an individual and had become an asset, an entry in a massive, sprawling database. Within the prison system, Watts was an immediate and profound anomaly. He was not a career criminal, not a product of a life of violence or gang affiliation. He was, on the surface, a middle-class suburban father who had committed a crime of almost mythological horror. For criminologists, prison officials, and his fellow inmates, he was a source of intense and morbid curiosity. He was the man who had pleaded for his family on television one day and confessed to their murders the next. For the investigators, a sense of professional finality was mixed with a lingering, unsatisfying question mark. Legally, the case was closed, but factually it remained deeply incomplete. They had his guilty plea on record, an admission to all 9 charges, including the murders of his daughters. Yet the only narrative he had ever provided, the one he'd whispered to his father in that interrogation room, was the one in which he blamed Shannon. The two realities were irreconcilable. A man who truly believed he had killed his wife in a rage after she had murdered his children would not, legally or morally, plead guilty to their murders. The plea was an admission, but his silence in court meant there was no accompanying story, no explanation for the contradiction. This narrative vacuum was a profound loose end. For the Arzusek family, it meant they were left with a version of events that grotesquely and falsely vilified their daughter, even though the killer had legally admitted otherwise. For the investigators, it was a missing chapter in their final report, a psychological riddle that had not been solved. The immediate concern for the Department of Corrections, however, was far more pragmatic: security. In the brutal, unwritten code of prison society, those who harm women, and most especially children, occupy the lowest and most reviled rung. Christopher Watts was not just another killer. He was arguably the most infamous inmate in the entire Colorado system. He was a target. The threat of violence against him was not a possibility, it was a certainty. He was immediately placed in protective custody, isolated from the general population, a decision made not for his comfort, but for his preservation. It quickly became clear that keeping him safe within Colorado's prison system would be a perpetual, high-risk challenge. A transfer, far away to a place where he would be just another anonymous face in a maximum security facility, was already being considered. The man who had sought to escape his life in Frederick was about to be forcibly exiled once again. Weeks turned into months. Christopher Watts, now inmate 674-556, settled into the profoundly monotonous and isolated reality of life in protective custody. His days were a Spartan, repetitive loop: meals delivered through a slot in his cell door, an hour of solitary recreation in a caged enclosure, the long, silent hours in between. He was a prisoner within a prison, his infamy a cage as real and confining as the concrete walls around him. The life of thrilling freedom he had envisioned with a new partner was a bitter, ironic joke against the backdrop of this stark, colorless existence. For the investigative team, the professional adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by the mundane rhythm of new cases, new reports, and new tragedies. Yet the Watts case lingered. It was a file that was legally closed, but psychically, it remained wide open. The profound dissonance between his guilty plea to all the murders and the self-serving, rage-kill story he had told was a gaping, unanswered question that gnawed at the core investigators. It wasn't about legal necessity. It was about the fundamental human need for a coherent, truthful narrative. The Arzusek family, most of all, deserved to know the full and unvarnished truth of their loved one's final hours. The idea for a final interview began as a quiet conversation among the lead agents from the CBI, the FBI, and the Frederick Police Department. There was nothing more to gain from a legal perspective. Watts had waived all his appeals. Anything he said now could not change his sentence. This would not be an interrogation, it would be an intelligence debriefing. The goal was simple and singular: to get the final, complete, and truthful account of what happened inside 2825 Saratoga Trail. It was an attempt to close the psychological file on the case for the benefit of the family, for the historical record, and for their own peace of mind. They knew the odds were long. Watts had every right to refuse. He had no incentive to talk. He had nothing to gain, and potentially the small comfort of his internal narrative to lose. Nevertheless, the formal request was made through official channels, a letter sent from the investigators in Colorado to the prison authorities in Waupun, Wisconsin, where Watts had been quietly transferred for his own safety. To their immense surprise, the response came back in the affirmative. Christopher Watts was willing to talk. The reason for his consent can only be speculated upon. Perhaps it was the crushing boredom of solitary life, a desire for human contact of any kind. Perhaps it was a narcissistic impulse to have the final word, to be the author of his own story once more. Or perhaps, in the profound silence of his cell, a small, dormant seed of conscience had begun to sprout, a need to finally unburden himself of the weight of the full truth, no matter how monstrous. Whatever his motive, the meeting was set. On February 18, 2019, nearly 6 months to the day after he had loaded his family into his truck and driven them to their graves, the same investigators he had lied to so brazenly prepared to meet him one last time. They traveled not to a local police department, but to the bleak, imposing fortress of the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. They were not there as adversaries this time, but as chroniclers, armed with a digital recorder and a final set of questions, hoping to capture the last, terrible chapter of the story from the only person who could tell it. The journey to Waupun, Wisconsin, was a stark pilgrimage. Agent Tammy Lee, FBI Agent Grom Coder, and Detective Dave Baumhover traveled hundreds of miles, crossing state lines, venturing into a landscape of frozen, snow-swept fields that seemed to mirror the emotional desolation of their mission. Dodge Correctional Institution, a hulking, razor-wired complex rising from the flat prairie, was the physical manifestation of the end of the line. It was here, in this remote citadel of punishment, that the final truth of the Watts case resided. The security protocols were intense, a world away from the relative accessibility of a local police station. They were escorted through a series of thick, buzzing steel doors, each one clanging shut behind them with an air of irreversible finality. The air inside was sterile, tinged with the faint, institutional smell of disinfectant and despair. When Christopher Watts was led into the small, bare-walled interview room, the physical transformation was startling. The man they had interrogated 6 months prior had still been physically robust, his body still carrying the muscle from his gym routine, his face filled out. The man who sat before them now was diminished. He was paler, significantly thinner, and the hollow emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a look of profound, soul-deep resignation. He wore the drab, loose-fitting uniform of a Wisconsin inmate. The performance was over. The lies were gone. All that was left was the man. The agents set up a small digital recorder on the metal table between them. There were no pleasantries, no small talk. Agent Coder initiated the conversation, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "Chris, thanks for agreeing to talk to us," he began. "As you know, your plea agreement is finalized. There are no more legal proceedings. Nothing you say here today can change your sentence. We're here because there are still questions that need answers for the Arzusek family and for us. We're here for the whole truth from beginning to end." Chris Watts looked at the three faces across the table, the people who had been the architects of his downfall. He took a slow, deep breath. He didn't hedge, he didn't deflect, he nodded. "I know," he said, his voice a low, raspy murmur. I shouldn't have lied about what happened." Agent Lee took the lead. "So that story you told us, the one about the fight and what you said Shannon did to the girls, that wasn't true, was it?" He shook his head slowly. "No, that wasn't true. She never would have hurt them." It was the first critical admission, the official demolition of the lie that had vilified his murdered wife. With that single statement, he had absolved her, leaving himself as the sole and undisputed monster of the story. "Okay, Chris," Lee continued, her tone remaining even encouraging. "Then we need you to take us back. Take us back to the moment Shannon got home. What really happened?" He closed his eyes for a moment, as if accessing a dark, walled-off room in his memory. When he opened them, he began to speak. And what followed was a 5-hour monologue of horror, a flat, monotonous, and chillingly detailed account of how a husband and father, in the space of a few hours, methodically and consciously erased his entire family from the face of the earth. The final, terrible chapter was finally being told. In the stark, antiseptic silence of the prison interview room, the story of what truly happened began to unspool, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating admission of a failed life. Christopher Watts started his narrative before Shannon even walked through the door in the early hours of August 13th. He painted a picture of a man who had already, in his own mind, left his marriage. "The whole week Shannon was in Arizona," he began, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I was with Nickel. It was easy, it felt new. And when I thought about Shannon coming home, I didn't want that. I didn't want to go back to that life." He described a profound sense of dread that had settled over him that Sunday. He told the investigators that he had even given Shannon's mother, Sandra, a hug that weekend and thought to himself, "I'm never going to see you again." It was a chilling admission of premeditation, a glimpse into a mind that was not just contemplating a different future, but actively planning the demolition of its present. He then walked them through the final hours. Shannon arrived home, tired from her delayed flight but happy to be back. He described their final intimate act, a moment that in his telling was not about love or connection, but was a detached, almost mechanical gesture. It was a prelude, an eerie calm before the storm. "Afterwards," he continued, "we were just lying there in the dark, and I told her. I told her that I didn't think we were compatible anymore, that I didn't want to be with her." He said Shannon didn't yell or scream. She had sat up in bed, her face a mixture of hurt and disbelief. He described her as becoming emotional, tearfully telling him that he was wrong, that their family was perfect, that he would never find another woman who loved him as she did. She had told him, he claimed, "You're not going to see the kids again." This, he identified, was the trigger, but it was not a trigger for a blind, uncontrollable rage as he had once claimed. In this new, horrifying telling, it was the trigger for a cold, calculated decision. Shannon was not just an obstacle to his new life with Nickel Kessinger anymore. She was now a threat. She was a gatekeeper to his children, and in his narcissistic, selfish calculus, that was unacceptable. "I just got on top of her," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his eyes staring at a point on the table between them. "And I put my hands around her neck." Agent Tammy Lee leaned forward slightly, her voice low but firm, pressing for the detail that mattered most. "Did she fight, Chris?" He shook his head slowly. "Not at first. I don't know if she even knew what was happening. Her eyes just filled with blood. And then she was gone." The description was clinical, the detached observation of a mechanic describing a faulty engine part. He spoke of the act of killing his pregnant wife not with remorse or horror, but with a flat, procedural accuracy. He had murdered Shannon in their marital bed, in the home they had built together, the place her daughters were sleeping peacefully just one room away. The first and most critical act of his fresh start was complete. And in the silence that followed, he had a new, more horrifying problem to solve. What to do with the witnesses? With Shannon dead, the quiet of the master bedroom was now a heavy, oppressive silence. In that funereal stillness, Christopher Watts's problem had transformed. He no longer had a wife to divorce. He had a body to dispose of. And he had 2 sleeping children just down the hall who were now inconvenient, living proof of the life he was trying to erase. "After it was over," he told the investigators, his narrative continuing in that same unnervingly placid tone, I sat there for a minute. The house was so quiet, and I knew I had to get her out of the house. I had to get her out before the girls woke up." He described the awkward, physically demanding task of moving Shannon's body. He recounted wrapping her in the fitted sheet from their bed, a detail that was both practical and chillingly intimate. The body, he noted with a detached coolness, was heavy, a dead weight that was difficult to manage. This was when the narrative took a turn into a surreal domestic nightmare. He started to drag her body towards the top of the stairs, a slow, grim procession out of their shared life. He said he had made it to the landing when the small voice of his daughter, Bella, cut through the silence. "What's wrong with Mommy?" He looked up. His 4-year-old daughter was standing at the top of the stairs, clutching a blanket, her face a mask of sleepy confusion. A few moments later, his 3-year-old, Celeste, appeared beside her. They had been woken by the sounds of their mother's body bumping against the walls. In his previous confession to his father, he had claimed his daughters were already dead, victims of their mother's rage. In this new, horrifyingly truthful version, they were very much alive, confused, scared, and unwitting witnesses to their own mother's funeral procession. Agent Lee, her voice tight, pressed him. "What did you say to them, Chris?" He hesitated. a rare flicker of something that might have been shame crossing his features. I told them that Mommy was sick, that she wasn't feeling good and we had to take her to the hospital. The lie was as simple as it was monstrous. He was using their innate trust in him, their childish belief in his every word, as a tool of control. He had just murdered their mother, and now he was calmly reassuring them, weaving a fiction to keep them docile and manageable. The investigators listened, their professional facades a thin shield against the rising tide of horror. They were listening to the minute-by-minute breakdown of a familicide, a chronicle of a father's ultimate betrayal, told with the emotional detachment of a man recounting a trip to the grocery store. He described how he managed to get Shannon's body the rest of the way down the stairs and out into the garage. He had placed her on the floor of the truck's back seat. He then went back into the house for his daughters. They were still at the top of the stairs, clutching each other, watching their father. He told them calmly to go get their shoes. They were going on a trip to help Mommy, and because he was their daddy, their protector, their hero, they obeyed. He had broken the ultimate taboo. Now he was leading his living children on a death march, their journey's end a place of unimaginable darkness and finality. I put the girls in the truck, Chris Watts continued, his voice a low, unwavering monotone. Cease had her blue blanket. Bella had her. She had one of the pink and purple ones. They were quiet. They were scared. The investigators sat across from him, the small, featureless room in the Wisconsin prison, now a theater of the macabre. They were listening to an account that defied all known parameters of human empathy, a story of a journey into the abyss, both literally and figuratively. The image he painted was a surreal, horrific tableau. Two small, confused children buckled into their car seats, their mother's lifeless body wrapped in a sheet at their feet, driving through the pre-dawn darkness with the man who was both their father and their executioner. "What was that drive like, Chris?" Agent Grom Coder asked, his question a soft but persistent probe into the darkest part of the timeline. "It was long," Watts replied, a masterpiece of vacant understatement. He recounted how the girls, who were normally boisterous and chatty in the car, were eerily silent for most of the 45-minute journey to Survey 319. They huddled together, clutching their blankets, two small points of innocence in a vehicle that had been transformed into a mobile crypt. He said Celeste eventually drifted off to sleep, succumbing to the exhaustion and the unnatural hour. But Bella, ever the more perceptive and anxious child, remained awake, and she was watching him. Then came the single, most soul-crushing detail of the entire 5-hour confession, a moment that would forever define the profound, conscious cruelty of his actions. Bella, her voice small and trembling from the back seat, asked her father a question. It was a question born of a 4-year-old's dawning, terrifying comprehension of the scene she was trapped in. Watts recounted her words to the investigators, his voice for the first time seeming to catch, just for a moment. "She asked me, is the same thing going to happen to me as Mommy?" The question was a direct, devastating indictment, delivered from the back seat of his own truck. In that moment, Bella Watts, at 4 years of age, was no longer just a victim of a crime. She was its primary sentient witness, a child who had processed the horror of her mother's fate and had understood that she was next. She had looked evil in the face and recognized it, even though it wore the face of her own father. The investigators exchanged a quick, stricken glance. This single detail annihilated any possibility, however remote, of a dissociative state or a crime of uncontrolled passion. This was not a man who had snapped. This was a man who, when confronted by his own daughter about his intent to murder her, had remained steadfast in his mission. He was not a father driven mad by circumstance. He was a predator, and his own children were his prey. The journey continued in silence after that. Bella's question hung in the cab of the truck, unanswered, a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled at their desolate, industrial destination. The arrival at Survey 319 was not an end to the horror, but the beginning of its final, most brutal act. As Chris Watts navigated his truck along the gravel tracks of the remote oil field, the first faint glimmers of the sunrise were just beginning to stain the eastern horizon. The landscape was a stark, alien world of steel and prairie grass, a place of profound and inhuman indifference. For the two little girls in the back seat, it must have seemed like the edge of the world. Watts recounted the next steps with the same cold, procedural detail he had used to describe the murders themselves. His narration was that of a man completing a sequence of tasks, his words devoid of the monstrous emotional gravity of his actions. "First thing I did," he told the agents, "was take Shannon's body out. I pulled her out of the truck and dragged her over to near the tanks. I had a small rake. I just dug a shallow hole, and I put her in it." He described the act of burying his wife as a purely logistical problem. The ground was hard. The task was physically taxing. His description was devoid of any sense of ritual or remorse. He was not burying the mother of his children. He was hiding evidence. Through it all, his two daughters, awake and terrified, watched from the windows of the truck as their father, their protector, erased their mother from the face of the earth. Once that task was complete, he walked back to the truck. He opened the passenger side door. Celeste, or Cease as he called her, was just stirring from sleep. Bella was wide awake, her eyes huge, and filled with a terror that a child should never know. Agent Tammy Lee's voice was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the horror of the story. "Who did you go to first, Chris?" "Cease," he replied, his voice flat. "I went to Cease first." He described taking the little blue blanket that she had clutched for the entire ride, the one that had been her source of comfort, and placing it over her head. He smothered his 3-year-old daughter as she sat buckled in her car seat. "Did she fight?" one of the agents asked, the question hanging heavy in the sterile room. "No," Watts said. "She didn't. She just went." After she was still, he unbuckled her from her seat, carried her small, lifeless body to the nearest oil tank, climbed the steel ladder to the top, opened the thief hatch, and dropped her in. He described hearing the faint splash as her body hit the surface of the cold crude oil below. But his work was not done. Back in the truck, Bella had witnessed everything. She had seen him murder her little sister. She had seen him carry her away and drop her into that dark, monstrous tank. "Bella," he began, and for the first time in the entire 5-hour confession, his voice audibly cracked with something that might have been a shard of memory or shame. Bella was the one that fought. He told them that as he came for her, she had screamed, a desperate, final plea that would echo in the empty plains of that oil field forever. She had cried out the last words he would ever hear her speak. "Daddy, no." The prison interview room, already a space of profound psychological weight, seemed to compress under the gravity of Bella Watts's final, desperate plea. For the investigators listening, the words "Daddy, no" were a direct and visceral impact, a soundbite from a nightmare that encapsulated the ultimate betrayal at the heart of this entire case. They had spent months piecing together a timeline of events through data and inference. Now they were hearing the human soundtrack, and it was a sound of unbearable heartbreak and terror. Chris Watts continued his account of Bella's last moments. His voice, which had faltered for a second, returned to its flat, detached monotone, a defense mechanism against the enormity of the memory he was recounting. "She knew what was happening," he said, stating the obvious with a chilling simplicity. "She fought. She struggled." He described using the same method on Bella as he had on Celeste. Her own blanket, a soft, familiar object of comfort, transformed into a weapon. He detailed the act of smothering his last living child with a clinical precision that was, in itself, a form of monstrous violence. He mentioned how much stronger Bella was than Celeste, how the act had required more effort, more sustained pressure. It was during this final, terrible struggle that the forensic evidence from the autopsy, the bite marks on her tongue, found its horrifying context. It was the physical record of her silent, terrified screams, the only protest her small body could make as her life was being stolen by the hand she had always trusted to hold and protect her. When her struggles ceased, he performed the same ghastly ritual he had with her sister. He unbuckled her from her car seat, carried her limp form to the second oil tank, climbed the ladder, and pushed her body through the 8-inch hatch. He didn't watch it fall. He just let go. His family was now gone, annihilated. The investigators were silent for a long moment, allowing the full, crushing weight of the story to settle in the small room. The narrative was complete.